Hey everyone, today I'm going to ramble about the base tryptamines for a while. So, if you don't know what the base tryptamines are, they're the sort of common name for the tryptamines that are only substituted on the amine group. So, that means no 4 subtryptamines, not psilocin, that doesn't count, not psilocybin, not 4-ACO DMT, no 5 substituted tryptamines. So, I just mangled that word. 5 substituted. So no 5-MeO DMT and nothing alpha substituted either. So no AMT or AET or anything. We're only talking about um, tryptamines with stuff on the amine. So these two little end spots at the end. The most famous base tryptamine is DMT, of course. So the rest of these, if you're not into organic chemistry and you didn't understand that, 20-second ramble, effectively these are DMT analogs. But DMT is kind of its own topic and deserves its own video, and I could ramble about it for an hour, so I'm not going to talk about it too much here. I'm usually really just going to use it as a sort of a comparison point for the other base tryptamines. I'm going to be comparing other ones against it. I'm not going to talk about it in depth because that is too big of a topic on its own to cover in addition to the other stuff. It would sort of just overshadow everything else. Um, Okay, and then also before we start, I want to make a note. The term base tryptamines is somewhat controversial and disliked by some people, mostly because base actually means something in chemistry, and the base tryptamines aren't bases. But I'm going to use that term because it is the most common term, and like the alternatives aren't that great because there's the term simple tryptamines, which I suppose works but isn't very common. And then there's, you could call them unsubstituted tryptamines, but that would be wrong because they are substituted on the amine. And then, call them dialkylated maybe, but that's just, I don't know, that's wordy and I don't want to bother doing that. So I'm going to call them base tryptamines. If that annoys you, sorry. It's only a topic of contention among a very small part of the research chemical community, so I kind of doubt it will annoy many people too. But anyways, why am I talking about the base tryptamines today? Well, most classes of drugs, and particularly tryptamines, are pretty similar for the most part. Like the 4 subtryptamines, for example, are mostly all pretty similar to mushrooms and psilocin. Like there are some differences, but none of them are totally out of line with that effect profile. Whereas the base tryptamines, there are 2 that are truly weird and don't fit in at all with the rest of them, and we'll be getting to those. But that's why this class interests me. There's some oddities going on. Okay, the first base tryptamine that's not DMT that I'm going to talk about here is MET. And the reason I'm talking about MET is it's sort of a good comparison point for a lot of the rest of these. It's very similar in a lot of ways to the rest of the drugs we're going to be talking about. So it's sort of going to be our standard against which to compare, other than DMT, of course. It's supposed to be qualitatively very similar to DMT, but just a lot weaker. So, breakthrough, if that's possible on this drug, I've never come close to it. And I don't believe I've ever read a trip report of that. It doesn't seem to be very possible. It's sort of just, actually, a lot of people describe it like DMT light or beginner's DMT or something like that. A lot of people also say, and this I can agree with, that it's very similar to the portion after you come out of a DMT trip. So, like, anyone who's ever been to the waiting room or broken through on DMT knows that when you sort of open your eyes and come back to the real world, there's a minute or so of where you still have pretty strong, intense visuals. And MET at its peak is like that. It's not as strong as DMT, but it's similar in terms of what it's like to be on it, if that makes sense. So yeah. Now, and of course that's one of the commonalities with a lot of the rest of these base tryptamines. A lot of them are like that. They're like DMT but weaker. Now the problem with MET is ROAs. There's no good way to take this drug, really. I mean, there are a few. So you can't really just take it orally. It is orally active, but it's super not potent. So, for example, one time I took 100 milligrams of MET, which is like by any other ROA would be a huge amount, and I felt it and I tripped, but it was very mild. So, and that matches other people's experiences as well. So it's not that you can't really take it orally. You can snort it. That does work, and that's usually how I take this drug. But it is painful, and the drip does suck, so it's not optimal. But it is worth it. It's a nice trip, and it's not that bad. I suppose you could plug it or IV it or IM it or something. I've never done any of those either for this drug or for any drug, but I suppose they would work. Probably not recommended, the last two at least, but I suppose you can vaporize it, but you probably want to vaporize it as the freebase, and it usually gets sold as the salt. And depending on which salt, some are worse than others, but some of them are really difficult to vaporize, and some of them produce nasty byproducts. So you generally want to convert it to freebase, which is kind of a pain in the ass. And I have done that too, and it works, but just a pain. And then it's difficult to vaporize too. If you need an effective DMT administration method basically, and DMT can also be difficult to smoke. So depending on what method you're using, of course, but. So that's a problem, and again, that's mirrored in a lot of these drugs. A lot of them are very problematic when it comes to actually taking them. And then there's one last option, which those of you who are familiar with DMT will know. You can get around the lack of oral bioavailability by taking an MAOI, because the reason that the base tryptamines, or a lot of them at least, aren't orally, don't work orally, is that monoamine oxidase breaks them down in your gut. So if you take them with an MAOI, then you get around that, and obviously that's what ayahuasca is. It's taking DMT with an MAOI so that it's orally active. And I have done this once. The problem is that I intended it to be only MET, but I actually didn't have enough, and so it was a combination of MET and EPT, which we'll be talking about in a little bit. So it doesn't really speak to just this drug, but I can say it was probably the strongest base tryptamine experience I've ever had. Or actually, excluding DMT, of course. DMT was stronger than that, and I've never done ayahuasca, so I can't speak to that. But if you want to get a strong trip out of these base tryptamines, that might be the way to go. It's fairly untested waters for a lot of them, so be careful and do your research as always, but it is a possibility. So and I already described what this drug is generally like for people. I haven't given any of my own trip reports, largely just because I kind of just described all I can describe. They're not extremely intense. It's just a nice, pretty visual trip, fairly low mental strain. It's pretty great. And then the next one I want to talk about is probably the single most interesting one of these, in my opinion, which is DPT, and this is one of the weird ones. And this is one of the few drugs that is known to exist that is as strong as DMT. It's not obviously not the only one. There's 5-MeO-DMT and there's salvia and such, but this drug is another one. It does take higher doses than DMT, so if you want a DMT-like dose, you're going to have to take, well, it varies a lot by person, so I don't want to quote anything specific, but it does take a higher dose, but it is absolutely, you can do a full breakthrough type thing. This drug is weird. It's not just, I heard someone online describe it once as DMT's meth head cousin, and I think that's a decent description. It tends to be, a lot of people describe it as extremely dark and disturbing and hard to deal with. It's very mentally draining and taxing and difficult. It tends to bring up a lot of dark stuff in your past. That combined with the strength of DMT and the fact that by most ROAs this is going to last a lot longer than DMT is just, can be a recipe for disaster. So this is, I've also seen the description double black diamond psychedelic, which I think is a pretty good term. It's you don't want to do this if you're inexperienced with psychedelics. But on the other side, there are a lot of people who have nothing but good experiences with this drug too. It has a tendency to elicit very religious experiences, even more so than a lot of other drugs. And there was actually a church called the Temple of the True Inner Light in New York at one point. That was, I don't know if they're still operating. I don't think they're still operating. But they use DPT as a sort of holy sacrament type thing. And that's not just them. It does seem to be fairly common to have religious type or like enlightenment type experiences. So, Now I suppose I should go into into my experiences with DPT. The first time I took it, I snorted 20. Every time I've taken it, I've snorted it. And the first time I snorted 25 milligrams, which I knew would be a fairly low amount because I knew this drug was extremely powerful. And I remember it hit me quite fast, and it wasn't initially very visual at all. I mean, there were some visuals, but it was mostly mental effects and very weird mental effects. Like, I remember the first thing I remember happening was I just started having a conversation with a friend that wasn't there, but like not in the way that people do on, say, diphenhydramine or something. Like, I didn't think my friend was there. I knew that I was alone. I just sort of started role playing a conversation for no reason. And I didn't like choose to start doing that. It just happened. And I don't remember what the conversation was about either. So that was very odd. And then about an hour into it, maybe, I realized that it was plateauing and it was interesting, but I wanted to do more, and I had planned on maybe taking some more as well. So I snorted another 25 milligrams. And I felt it coming up very quickly, so I went to lay down in my bed and probably put music on, and I closed my eyes, and I see these two interlocking glowing green gears, which interestingly is the only machinery hallucination I've ever had. I've never had machinescapes or anything like some people describe. And these gears are turning, and then they slowly pull apart, so their teeth aren't meshed together anymore. They're sort of coming apart. And I look through them, and I realize I'm looking down at the ground from like 10,000 feet or something, like the height of an airplane. I don't know what general cruising altitude is, but roughly the height of an airplane. But I'm not falling. I'm just looking at the ground. But I'm also not in an airplane. I'm just at that height. So my brain is sort of slowly trying to process how this is working. Like, why am I not falling towards the ground? It doesn't make any sense. And after a couple seconds, I realize I I realize that my feet are on the ground and my ankles have been extended to like several thousand feet long, so that I am up in the air. I know this sounds weird as hell, but I swear it's exactly what happened. And so the instant I realize that my feet are still on the ground, they retract back into themselves, so my body's its normal shape again, and I'm at 10,000 feet in the air or whatever. And I start falling, and then the other parts of my body start doing the same thing in sequence. So the next part of my body is sort of the area between my upper and lower jaw extends in that way to some ridiculous length, and then contracts back into itself. And then my arm does it, and then all different parts of my body start doing it. And I keep falling, and I don't remember anything else until waking up the next morning. So that was one of the oddest things I've ever experienced in any sense. But it wasn't like, I'm pretty sure I knew the whole time that I was tripping. Like, it didn't feel like, I don't even know. It didn't feel like I was that mentally fucked up. I was just sort of, I don't know. It's difficult to describe. And then the second time I took that drug, I snorted 70 milligrams of it. And despite the fact that I didn't have a tolerance at the time, anything happened. So I have no idea what's up with that. I mean, I tripped, but it wasn't even remotely as strong as the first time, and that should be more, like significantly more, so I don't know. And then the last time was probably the least pleasant trip I've ever had. I snorted 90 milligrams of it, and almost immediately had this overwhelming sense that I'd fucked up really badly. Like, I've heard people describe sense of impending doom before, and that's a pretty decent description. I don't know about doom, but like impending very bad time type thing. So I went to lay down and very quickly was extremely nauseous and had to throw up. And I basically spent the rest of the trip, like 4 hours or so, or maybe 3, I don't know. There was pretty extreme time dilation, so it's hard to say exactly, but I spent the whole time just basically projectile vomiting and then dry heaving into my trash can. And this whole time I was extremely both visual tripping and mentally fucked up as well. So the visuals, I remember a lot of like black and colorless visuals that were moving extremely quickly to the point where it was very disorienting. Like, I couldn't look at anything and understand what it was because the visuals were obscuring it. And I was super, like, had trouble remembering where I was, and I remembered that, like, I couldn't remember which drug I was on, but I remembered that I was on a drug. So I could tell myself, okay, this will end soon. I've taken a drug, it will end. But I didn't know what I was on exactly, so I was, like, forgetting things. But it wasn't, I wasn't, yeah, I don't know. It's one, yeah. It's not one that I like to think about that often. It wasn't, like, traumatizing or anything. Like, the next day I was totally fine. It was just super unpleasant while I was in it. But yeah, so there was that. What else is there to say about this drug? Oh, okay. So this is one of the very few tryptamines that has actually caused a death. There was one kid that took, I think it was 100 milligrams or maybe more, and had a seizure and died. So be aware of that. If you're prone to seizures, do not take this drug. And all that. There's also one of the best trip reports I've ever read is a 150 milligram DPT trip report on Arrowhead called The Process and the Infinite Oneness. I highly recommend reading it if you're at all interested in psychedelics even. It's great. Okay, now after that long ramble, let's move on to EPT, which is much more similar to MET than DPT is. It tends to be most descriptions I've heard online don't differentiate that much from MET, just sort of like DMT but weaker, same sort of thing. But in my experience, it was very similar, except I would occasionally get flashes of super, like, complex 3D immersive closed-eyed visuals that I haven't ever gotten on MET. Usually I get very, like a lot of open-eyed stuff on MET and not that much closed-eyed. EPT has these flashes of complex geometry, which is very cool. The other notable thing is that it seems to hurt a lot less to snort than most base tryptamines. And that's yeah, I don't know what's up with that, but it does seem to be a thing, at least for me. Most of these are quite painful, and EPT, like, hurts a little bit, but it's not that bad. Okay, and then the last two that I've actually tried are MPT and Malt, both of which I've vaped once at fairly low doses, and both of which I enjoyed, but I don't have that much to say about them. Both of them are, again, compared quite frequently to MET, just sort of standard base tryptamines. Another reason that I picked up Malt, or MALT, whatever you want to call it, was that there's this trip report on Reddit that says that it amplified 5-MeO-DMT to a crazy degree, which seems to indicate that it may be an MAOI or something, or in some other way interacting with other psychedelics. So I definitely want to try that in combination with other things, but I haven't done that myself yet. So, maybe there'll be an update to this at some point, and I'll be able to give a trip report on that, but I don't know. All right, and then we move into the ones that I haven't taken. The first one being DET, which is scheduled or illegal basically everywhere because it's in the UN Convention on Psychotropic Substances. So there's not that much to say about it. It was widely available at one point. A lot of people liked it. It seems to be more powerful than MET generally. And interestingly, it is one of the ones here that is orally active at reasonable doses. Most of them aren't, again, as I said earlier, in the MET section, but a few of them are, and DET is one of them. Okay, and then DIPT, which is the other really weird one here. This drug is barely psychedelic at all. I mean, if you take a lot of it, you can get standard trippy effects, but the main effect of it is this weird audio distortion that I've never taken it, of course, so I can't describe it myself. Funnily enough, I actually got some just a few days ago, but I haven't tried it yet. But people describe everything being pitch shifted down, and there's like this electronic or robotic, it's like sound effect. Like if you've ever heard one of those like voice changer things, it sounds almost like that. I don't know. It's interesting. I don't know what else to say. This one definitely seems to be like the structure is doing something in your brain that the other ones aren't, which is very interesting. And more evidence for this is that both the 4-substituted and 5-substituted tryptamines for DIPT are both also quite interesting. So 4-HODIPT is extremely potent and extremely short-lasting compared to the other 4 subs. And there's a great T-call entry for it if you're interested. And then 5-MeO-DIPT is sort of more entactogenic than most of the 5-MeOs, which is also true for 5-MeO-MIPT, so it's not totally unique there. But, you know, in all 3 of those classes, this base structure seems to be doing something a bit different than most of the other ones, so this one's interesting. It's intriguing to me. Okay, and then there's a bunch that we don't have that much information on, so I'll just sort of go through them quickly. There's MIPT, which is one of the orally active ones. It's also usually described as being very bland and uninteresting and not that worth trying. There's EIPT, which seems it was only ever made by Shulgin. 5-MeO EIPT was available at one point, but this isn't the video for talking about that. EIPT itself, Shulgin didn't like it very much, and no one else has tried it, so, you know, again, not much to say. PIPT, this one actually was available on RC markets for a while. There are a few trip reports that are positive, so I'd like to see it show up again, and I'd maybe talk about it in the future. But again, not that much to say. There's like 5 trip reports and nothing else, so we don't know anything. And then there's the rest of the allylated tryptamines. So DALT right here is actually almost inactive itself, which is interesting. It doesn't really make sense. But of course we know MALT is active, so it's not all allylated tryptamines are inactive. And then a lot of the other ones haven't been made as far as I can tell. So EALT and PALT and whatever IPALT or ALIT, I've seen both of them for this drug. You know, they've been hypothesized, but as far as I can tell, they don't actually exist and never have. So, you know, that's future research areas, I suppose. So if you've been paying attention here, you will have noticed that all of these, the groups on the amine here, the substitutions, are maximum 3 carbons. So either a propyl group or an isopropyl group or an allyl group. But of course we can go higher. So this, for example, is DBT, which is one of the few groups with more than 3 carbons on it that's been made, or drugs rather, with more than 3 carbons on it that's been made. Dibutyltryptamine with 4, as you can see on either side. This is sort of a teaser to a future video, I guess, because I'm interested in the butylated tryptamines, and I found some interesting things with regard to them. There's some weird stuff going on with a few of them. So, yeah, you know, I'd like to make that in the future, but basically you can keep going forever, and the reason they haven't been investigated that much is they tend to get less potent. Like, if you've been paying attention, you'll notice DMT is stronger than DET, which is more potent than DPT. But you know, that doesn't mean these aren't worth investigating. There's some interesting stuff going on, and where some further research could go. Okay, so that's about all I have. If I made an error anywhere, please let me know in the comments and I'll fix them. I hope I didn't. I try to do research, but yeah. Anyways, I'll ramble about drugs another day. See ya.